There are over 40 countries that have already hit peak population, meaning that they're depopulating. That really is remarkable. So there is an element of potential crisis if everything about your society, your social contract, your workplaces was set up at a time when there was presumably infinite growth and relatively steady young population aging into the workforce, and that whole backdrop changes, but you don't do anything. That's where you get a crisis.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Looking Outside. Today we're going to talk about the population crisis, declining fertility rates, an aging population, mass migration. But is it a crisis? This is a topic that is really important to business because we forecast our growth based on a very predictable population growth pattern. But as with any topic, this one is complex and has multiple sides. So we're going to dive into that today with political demographer, Jennifer Sciubba. Hey, Jennifer.
Hello. So glad to get to have this conversation with you.
I'm so excited about this. This has been like a little bit of phone tag for us, if anyone's interested. So I've been dying to get Jennifer on the show. So let's start with a little intro into who you are.
Sure. Jennifer Sciubba. I'm the president and CEO of a lovely 96 years old this month, a nonprofit based out of Washington, D.C. called the Population Reference Bureau. And we use data and evidence to promote better decision-making around health and well-being and have done so for nearly a century. In a prior life, I was an academic trained as a political scientist, and I used demography as a way to view the world within political science, which of course is a lot of what we will talk about in the next time we have together.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think you forgot to mention that you're an esteemed author and highly regarded in the public space. I was just watching the little interview that you did with Wired magazine earlier today. That's very cool. Very cool.
Thank you.
So you have a lot of work that you put out publicly about this topic. Yeah. Is it a topic that you've been passionate about for a long time and you've stayed in that field digging into it, or is it something that keeps pulling you back?
No, I have indeed been passionate about it for a long time, and I think because again, relevant to your listeners, the way I got into it was I was so interested. I remember having a conversation with my advisor my senior year of college, and I said, who are the people out there who try to understand the real underlying causes of why things like war happen or why some countries are richer than others? I said, like the environment, like what are these real underlying causes, not these proximate causes? And she did indeed point me in the direction of some fine folks at the University of Maryland at the time, which was known for its environmental work within political science. And nobody knows exactly where to put somebody who's interested in population unless you're a demographer, which I wasn't. So that seemed like the fit there. So lots of courses on migration and all of that. But what keeps me interested is whenever I see these big macro issues that we're all tracking in terms of business or conflict, social relations, I see them through this demographic lens, and I feel like I understand them in a different way than other people might, and that there's real value in bringing that unique perspective. So it's not as if I was talking with some people earlier today, and I thought, oh, they misunderstand that the only thing I know about this population, it's that I try to use population to help me know a lot about other things to some success or not. I'm not sure, but that's what I always try to do.
Yeah, and you bring in all of these kind of interconnected issues together because it's not just that demographics influences other macro forces, it's that vice versa, and it's an ongoing kind of relationship between these things.
Yeah, and that's where I was drawn to PRB as well. I had been a fan for a couple of decades of their work, and that's really the exact space that PRB operates in as well. It's a deep understanding of the data, but also of the fact that it has to be contextualized, which I know you mentioned crisis at the beginning of this. And so this helps you understand to what degree is something a crisis or under what circumstances. And I think also a real passion that the organization has and that I share around science communication. It's really important that we're not just, I don't know, there's just this ubiquity of data these days. It's just everywhere. Every article is about something having to do with it. But there's one thing to put information in front of other people and another to make sure that they really understand it and understand how to use it. And I've always really cared about that. And that's what really drew me to PRB's mission and why I hope that we can all lean into that even more in this moment when there's so much trust that seems to have been broken between people and science, people and data. Perhaps I'm speaking as an American, but I think it really is to some degree worldwide, and it's something we really need to overcome.
I do think that there are a lot of misconceptions about this topic, and PRB's mission, I think, is a fantastic way to kind of dig into that and bust some myths in a way. Obviously, we have this population growth that's been quite steady. I think I was reading that the population has tripled since 1950, I think it was. So, like,
Probably
really
something like that.
nice problem. People, I mean, you
Yeah.
know better than me. You can
Yeah, yeah,
correct
yeah. It's all
any of
in
my
my
assumptions.
lifetime, so I was like, yeah, yeah.
Yes. So really, really nice kind of predictable population growth. And then obviously we had like a lot of initiatives from nations that were trying to increase their population and lifted restrictions, et cetera. And then it felt like all of a sudden we had a population crisis where we're now projecting this kind of plateau of population growth and then ultimately a decline. And it feels like everyone's like, hair is on fire. How do we put this out? Panic. And that
Yeah.
panic feels very, very recent.
Yeah.
Does this feel like a topic that's kind of been brought back into the front page for you?
It does. And I feel like I could back that up empirically as well, just as a student of population history and always being interested in that rhetoric over time. With that long look, and we don't have to make it too long, but we could go back centuries, but let's just stick in this century. Population seems to have always been a problem. But as you say, it was that there were too many people, or it was growing too quickly, or in different iterations of that would be women were having too many babies, right? And they needed to knock it off. This you can trace in government documents of just so many countries around the world. And then, as you say, it's like a switch was flipped. And in fact, we can actually show that empirically some as well. I have another book coming out next month, and it's called Toxic Demography: Ideology and the Politics of Population. I almost forgot what it's called. And it's with two lovely co authors, one a demographer, Michael Teitelbaum, and one a historian, Jay Winter, and I'm the political scientist. But we look at, Europe, United States, and Asia, and we actually see some of these points where decision makers decided, never mind, there's too few. And it's different points for different countries. I looked a lot more at Asia for our book, and it's exactly that it's like they kind of realized more recently how the shifts in women having fewer children on average over time were really catching up to what's showing up in terms of the working age population and the older population of people who are often dependents. And those potential economic implications are, of course, what scare them into a panic about how do we fix this.
I think some of the headlines also drive a bit of that panic, right? Because you have, I was reading, beginning in 2033, annual deaths will exceed annual births in the US. And obviously, this has a huge impact, as you mentioned, on the workforce. I think a lot of organizations are thinking about this topic, how they're going to recruit the next generation of workers. But, potentially we might see some things change as a result of that, where younger people might go into the care system because you have growing demand to care for an aging demographic. You might see the working age and retirement age change. So all of that feels pretty significant. But I mean, is it really that volatile?
It could be, is the cheater answer that I'll give. But my justification for that is, if we do nothing in terms of decision making around what is work like, and how do we organize ourselves in our societies or communities, but we have a dramatic shift in our age structure and we start depopulating. I mean, that's another part of it. It has only been 2 decades, well, a little over 2 decades, I guess. Time marches on since I started studying this. But, at that time, population aging was really just beginning to be talked about. And the old countries were really not that demographically old. But we now have, one of our demographers calculated, there are over 40 countries that have already hit peak population, meaning that they're depopulating. That really is remarkable if I think about in my short career, especially because we know that I'll have to work for many more decades, therefore it's short now. Um, it has really changed that much. So there is an element of potential crisis if everything about your society, your social contract, your workplaces was set up at a time when there was presumably infinite growth and relatively steady young population aging into the workforce, and that whole backdrop changes, but you don't do anything. That's where you get a crisis. If you do something, however, perhaps that crisis can be abated. And I think that's the point where we are these days. And it's not just governments, but of course, that's the easy one to talk about. But it can even be at the corporate level or even at the individual level. And that's been a theme of my week. I've spoken to so many interesting people. Dinner last night with a friend who is in her 50s and is studying for a new certification to like level up a new thing in her career, which just out of choice. At the same time that, other people might have thought that's when you should be winding down, right? And the day before that, someone who's about to retire for the second time, but will now go looking into nonprofit leadership and wanted to talk to me about that. It is not just government decision making or corporate decision making, but individual decision making that makes the difference as to whether or not something is a crisis or an opportunity.
I love that so much. I've heard you talk about this on another podcast and obviously in your book as well, that what we're doing in investigating demographic shifts and how they influence business, corporations, individuals is we're trying to instigate action. It's all well and good for an organization to know that these things are coming and to assess the impact on themselves, but there are certain changes that they can make in their regulations, policy, initiatives to prepare for that. But I think a lot of people see this topic as being very long term.
Yeah.
Like they kind of think, oh well, you know, it's going to impact us at scale so far out that it's a nice thing to observe, but it's not something that we need to act on today. Is that accurate?
No, it's a gift if that is true, the extent to which it might be true, which we're about to unpack, and I'll say no, it's not. What a gift that you are given. It's kind of like somebody saying, if you don't do X, you're going to get a significant diagnosis of cancer in 20 years, but you might be able to change that if you were to do something now. We certainly hope that somebody would do that. And I hate that I just compared population aging to cancer when I am an optimist. So don't take that too seriously. But the gift of a long-term view is really great. Now, as to whether or not it really is so far in the future, I don't think so. We have a different one of our demographers at PRB was looking at some of the US Census data, and between 2020 and 2024, so the years that just happened, 43% of US counties had shrinking populations. Those 1,300 US counties. Even though the place where I live right now is booming in terms of population, I did come from somewhere that actually lost the most people of any other county in the US in the year that I left. And I'm like, wow, I can actually see our family in those statistics. So for some cities, some counties, some particular, towns, or even some countries, it is already here. And that is why we need to not only look at national level statistics, but we need to keep peeling back layers. I mean, you could certainly talk to some corporations, I'm sure some you might have experience with in your lifetime, that would have difficulties recruiting for jobs in certain areas, and then in others have no problem. So look for where it's already happening and see that we can have these natural experiments now. Again, what a gift that you could put in place, try different policies, you have a real innovative leader. What can we try in these different places while we have a little bit of margin or breathing room so that we're better prepared for as this is only going to intensify?
The long-term view is a gift. I mean, if that could be my tagline for the work that we do in foresight, that would be it. It's beautifully put, because it gives you just enough time to be able to react. This is already playing out, is what you're saying. Like we're seeing the signals, we're seeing these shifts. Some things are moving faster than what we had anticipated. So it's the perfect time horizon bandwidth for
Yeah.
us to be able to instigate change. That's I mean,
And
who
I
doesn't want
think
to take advantage of that?
yeah, we should take advantage of it. And there's one other thing, just to connect back to how you teed up our
Mm.
conversation, that why I continue to be drawn to looking through a demographic lens is that it really, you have more certainty about that than you do other trends. And so I've always actually been involved in trends other than demography. Like I'm, whether it's environment or tracking economic trends and all of that. Who knows what will be going on with the housing market in a year? No one knows. There is no one who knows for what will actually be happening. But I can tell you the number of 6-year-olds in a year because I can count the number of 5-year-olds. And then you can extend that out. And so I think everyone in the foresight business should start with demography as like your warm up even, or your foundation. Both can be true. You start with this because you can use it as part of your practice and then start adding in more uncertainty. Build those layers in those ways.
The two examples that you gave are really interesting too. So you mentioned environment and climate change and economics as like two of the many areas that you'd be looking at and how they impact and are influenced by demographic shifts. As an example, what we know is that if there is a growing climate crisis, that mass migration will continue as a result of that. However, and obviously that means people moving to different parts of the world. However, what we know is that it's the rich who can bunker down and stay where they are, and it's the poor that are destined to have to move. So that even that is a really interesting dynamic when we're thinking about what could the future citizen or population mix of a nation and therefore your category be.
Or if the poor could even move, or if they have anywhere to go, right? Like we could just keep adding the layers onto it, which is where I like combining this demographic lens with something else. Like, well, and I always say migration is far more political than demographic. I think that you give a great example of why there's power in combining these.
Also there's the if government reacts in a positive, negative, neutral, whatever way to that kind of migration. You can play these scenarios out. But I like what you said before that there are some things in this topic that are more stable, more constant, more, for lack of a better word, more predictable. Are you able to, when you're looking at the array of different interconnected issues, pull apart what is more constant versus what is more of a variable?
I think so. And where people would disagree with me on it, I'll go ahead and say is they would disagree at the detail level. So, and we're seeing so much of this play out. It's going to end up getting too nerdy, so I won't go down a rabbit hole with it. But will population top out at 9 or 10 billion? And some people really care about whether or not it's 9 or 10. I say it doesn't really matter if it's 9 or 10. It was 4 when I was born. It's doubled in my lifetime. Now, it matters somewhere to some places. If the population of Nigeria, triples, it's going to matter to Nigerians. But at this planetary level, we're hardly going to notice if it's 9 or if it's 10. So I think there are places where we can sweep and say, what is the general trend? That we learn enough from the general trend that we don't have to worry about the specifics. And I see that also with fertility rates. Will they go back up? I don't know. No one knows. It also doesn't matter for our decision making right now because there's such a thing as population momentum, and then the future is baked into the present, which was baked into the past. And so I know kind of what population is going to look like for the next 20 years as far as the general set of issues we need to be thinking about. And that's good enough for me. Now, you can't really say that if you're talking about something like an interest rate where, 0.1 makes a big difference, but I think we can get away with it in demography. But I might have a minority view on that.
Is there any situation where the social sentiment around an issue impacts the trajectory? So you might say, well, for these fertility kind of dips, if it's sitting at, I think it's under 1.4 at the moment for 21 countries, and let's say it goes to 1.5, it's negligible, but you see a massive kind of societal pushback and like a female empowerment rebellion against don't tell us to have more babies, for example. Does anything like that influence things in a way that is worth kind of paying attention to in a shorter term?
Oh, in a shorter term, that's a good question. I mean, maybe not so much as how it affects a population target, but how it might affect other societal dynamics. And that again can connect to something that you had raised earlier and we had talked about when decision makers flipped that switch from too many to too few. with some of that, we have seen those decision makers, they'll pay close attention to whether or not that these things go up and down by a little bit, because what they seem to be measuring success as is whether or not the actual number changes. And what I've been trying to talk about on different podcasts and in different writings is, what if you switched away from a population target as your metric of success and some broader, I mean, even well being would be great. Like, are people doing better? That would be
Hmm.
nice. And you know what the side effect of that could be? Eventually, it actually could be that they do decide to have bigger families or start families earlier, etc. And so I think what you're saying in that question to me connects to the issue that we are often measuring, or not, not me personally, but many decision makers are measuring success as to whether or not the population target itself moves. And that may not be the best measure of success.
Right. It's going back to what you were saying before, like peeling the layers or adding more layers or peeling its layers basically, and looking a little bit deeper. When we think about some of the topics that business leaders are thinking about, China and India being kind of prime growth opportunity markets because they have these, growing population, growing middle class, a lot of multinational brands entering those markets, finding it challenging because it's complex dynamics. But one of the things that we talk about is, well, India is projected to reach the same labor force as China between 2040 and 2050. So I'm reading my
Yeah. Okay.
my poor man's research here. But there's a but, right? And this is the layering. They might have the numbers, but
Yeah.
they might not participate as much, or they might have a lower kind of
Absolutely.
female to male split in that labor force. And so, like, layering in those kinds of dynamics just creates such a rich picture that takes us beyond looking at it as a pure, like, predictable
Yep.
number.
Absolutely. I know what a great example you gave, because as long as you contextualize these numbers for India, you do see that the writing is not on the wall that you would expect female labor force participation to shoot through the roof. It just wouldn't. And a different example that I often use is dependency ratio. That's a number that, the Economist would use all the time, or, many other economic publications. But it doesn't actually tell you what proportion of the population may be old age dependents or young dependents or not. It's just really
Mhm.
what proportion of the population is above 65 is often like the cutoff there. And I often give a talk where I show a slide that compares, and admittedly, this is like a bit of a straw man, but it compares Japan and France and the very different cultures of work. And in the last year that, I think, is it 2022 is the last year that OECD put out data on effective retirement age. Um, and there was a 10-year difference between those two. So effectively, even though Japan was far older, meaning greater proportion of the population of what you would think of as retirement age, the greater proportion of France's population was actually retired, because the cultures of work were
Oh.
so different. 10 years, by the way, makes a huge difference when you're talking about countries that have millions and millions of people. And again, sometimes depending on what country I'm in when I give a talk, I'll run the numbers for, do you know how many people you have between 65 and 70? And if none of them are in the economy, then you might be, really squandering an opportunity there. Of course, you can't get all of them in the economy. Maybe they don't want to, but if you have such a huge number, you don't have to have all of them. You could just take the ones who want to.
It kind of took me back to some of the workshops that we did in foresight at McDonald's in the markets themselves and the paradigm shifts within the context of the country and kind of showing how these things are complex. So, you could say, for example, that in Greece you have the Mediterranean diet, you have it's a blue zone, it's a part of the world where people live longer and they can, I mean, this image of someone living out the last days of their life. And we often say that the last 8 years of your life is where your health and your well-being starts to kind of decline. So you're living longer, but not necessarily happier. But even in those countries, you could say maybe that's actually true of Greece. But then they might be impacted by declining mental health and well-being because it's not a culture that traditionally can talk about these things, right? So on paper, they look happier. In reality, there are issues that they can't express, which ultimately is about better understanding people, right? Like demographics is about understanding people.
They're just people. And And that isn't, it's one of the things I'm running into lately as well, is that when we think about some of the policies that are being floated around the world for changing demographics, they're often so divorced from how people actually go through their lives. All these numbers that we're talking about, they are just aggregates of individual lives, sometimes individual decisions to the extent that individuals have full capacity to make decisions about these types of things. But yeah, all individual lives. And so again, as a foresight exercise, it's really useful to jump those levels of analysis often and say, what if we're picturing this 8 billion people on the planet as 8 billion individuals? Does that help us understand why migration is so rare? For example, 96% of the planet still lives in the country in which they were born. It is rare to migrate. Now, it is not all that surprising when you start picturing like, well, what have I gone? Would you go? You have gone. And like under what, and then did you come back? And what did it look like to make these decisions? How complex was it? How many friends did you talk to? Family members? How many pieces of paper did you get out with like a pros and cons and the line down the center? And, start working through all of that. Then we can see why some of these trends look the way they do. I find that very useful to kind of jump back and forth, aggregate, like maybe a meso level and individual, and see what we learn.
Aggregated. I mean, it's naturally aggregated, but you're also talking about disaggregating it and getting to the one-on-one conversations with people. I think that's really important too, because a lot of these topics, and you mentioned it before, but they're very tense topics in many cases. They're kind of rife with an emotional response. So they have a very clear perspective of whether this thing is a good thing or a bad thing. The two, I think, would come to people's minds more naturally, which is migration. We talked about this before. And even in Australia, coming back to Australia now, I was like, oh, like that, we're a multicultural country. People are not going to be, protesting against this, that like we don't have a problem here. And turns out it is just as topical in Australia. So it's kind of filtering through all parts of the world. The second is fertility and this conversation around, women's liberation and our right and our right to choose, but also our role in many cases for perpetuating the population. And then the third one that I don't think people talk about a lot. So I'd love to get your perspective on particularly the third one, which is religion
Oh.
and the impact of religion on demographics.
Well, admittedly, I have not probably looked into this very much since I wrote 8 billion and counting, but I think I wrote about some stuff about religion in there. So I could point people there. But there are some general things we know, and there's things we would expect to be true that aren't. Like, for example, it has always surprises people, as it did me, how low Iran's fertility fell when we think like, oh, because one of the things people would often ask is, is a Muslim country more likely to have higher fertility rates than maybe one that's has a Confucian tradition or a Christian, those types of questions. And in Iran's case, even with quite religious government, they made the decision to put clinics, very accessible, so that people could get good health care, so that women could get this health care. And then these fertility rates really fell, and they're quite low. And there's still discussion over this today, which again I've only tracked somewhat, but again it did become like, whoa, should we have done that? Switch flips. Right, we see the switch flipping in so many cases, but that one went against most people's assumption that fertility rates would be higher. You look in the Gulf states, fertility tends to be lower there as well. But then in other parts of the world, I actually just saw some data before we came on from the Afrobarometer looking at different societies. And I was thinking about religion when I was looking at them. And I don't know if it would, and it was views about the place of women and whether or not they should be allowed to have control over their own decisions in life about whether or not they get married, for example. Considering that religion is part of culture, then to that degree is a very strong cultural reason why there's fertility rates are higher in those societies, because they do not think, in some of these places, that women should be educated, should have control over marriage, and should, have control over their reproduction. So Is it the religion? Is it culture? Is there a difference? I'm not sure. Well, we also know that even you can look at places in the United States that are much more religious. Certain communities and fertility rates are higher in those as well. And I think it's still the case that Utah has the highest fertility rate of any of the states in the United States, for example. It's not markedly higher in the sense that, maybe like 6, 7 children, but it is higher.
And Utah has a higher
Mormon. Yeah, Mormon.
religious.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh,
And I
Mormon.
think that is
Okay.
still the case, but you could please feel free to fact check that one. But yeah, and that's one, and certain Amish communities, Mormon communities, demographers have often studied over time as to whether or not those have higher fertility rates.
And I'm kind of putting you on the spot here, but I'm so curious because I know that you've written a little bit about Africa and Africa's growing population. And obviously, there are a lot of things, a lot of data showing us that they will be the biggest population. And obviously, Africa is a continent, not a country. And so it differs depending on what part of Africa you're looking at. But is there anything, any of those issues that are interconnected with their population growth also? I'm thinking growing middle class, access to healthcare would be improving. Maybe migration is less of a hot topic over there, so they have a growing kind of, maybe not.
No, maybe not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so yes and no. Some things are different, some things are the same. Migration, boy, these issues are the same everywhere. It just is so political, and it's maybe it's part of this human condition of the othering that we are just so want to do. But so you definitely do see that. And I write in that book about sons of the soil conflicts and just about how one group moving into another's territory can really lead to conflict there. So we do see throughout Africa that there is a political element to migration, of course, and it overlays with identity conflict there. Some things to continue to watch throughout different countries in the continent are the degree to which urbanization continues and what forms that takes, which groups are moving to cities, which are left behind, what happens in terms of, here's where I keep layering onto things. So I want to know things like, when people move to the cities, are they able to find jobs in very labor intensive industries that can take advantage of having a surplus of young workers? Or does that model not exist anymore like it would have for East Asia and manufacturing, for example? And if it doesn't and people move anyway, how does that affect conflict or social disarray? Or do they just end up moving back to rural areas? The average age of farmers throughout Africa, I was talking to a friend at AARP about this, it's quite high. So the farmers are really aging, and yet subsistence agriculture in many countries is still really predominant. So what does that mean? You can, again, overlay demographics onto these different parts of things. But besides just the fertility rates, the other thing to keep paying attention to, and the one we haven't talked about very much yet, though it could be on your list, is the third demographic component, which is mortality. And so there's been tremendous strides in terms of dealing with non-communicable diseases in poorer countries, including countries in Africa, but there's still a long way to go. And there's still a long way to go in terms of, oh, and I meant to say communicable diseases, but that's okay. It's true for both non-communicable and communicable. We made a lot of strides in communicable diseases, and we've made a lot non-communicable, but there's a long way to go for that. And when you're thinking in terms of what helps people to have a growing economy, we want to have a healthy population that feels optimistic about the future.
It's such an interesting aspect to layer into this. And I think what you touched on before for our listeners that maybe their ears would have pricked up, certainly mine did, was when you talked about farmers. And like anybody who listens to my podcast knows I'm like obsessed with this topic because I have a lot of, I've done a lot of work in agriculture, but also have just a ton of respect for farmers. But we know that the farming generation is, passing soon and not passing on their farms to the younger generation who are interested in other types of work. And so it's also a really interesting exercise to apply to an industry or a category. And if
Yep.
you're, obviously, if you're a brand owner of a chocolate product, you're thinking about your consumer, but you're also thinking about the cocoa farmers, you're thinking about the dairy farmers, you're thinking about the supply chain, truck drivers. I mean, this is literally a topic that is relevant no matter what aspect of your category or your industry that you're in. And it's really interesting to think about the future workforce of that industry, the future maybe perceptions of people working in those industries, what is going to be the future skill
Yeah.
of the future workforce as a result of all of these changes, which don't happen in isolation.
Absolutely. I've not thought about it in the same way that you've thought about it, but I have the book that I'm writing that will be after this one that's about to come out, which was written a while ago. In that one, I'm talking with a person who's become a friend of mine who is in Maui and talks about how hard it is to get any kind of person in the trades. You know, how hard it is to find somebody to work in the facilities and engineering and how that affects the high-end hotels there. And so, you know, I feel like we often say, oh, the trades. And you think about your household, maybe like, oh, how can I get somebody to install a new light in here? Which, by the way, I would love to have a different light in here. But no, it's how can the Four Seasons Hotel continue to operate without all of these people who actually make it work? And so, you know, that's one that I know many people have thought about, but when we start putting some numbers behind it, it kind of looks more and more dire.
Something that the NVIDIA CEO said, where, he said that the best job to be in the future is a plumber. It's those tactical trades when everybody's an engineer and all of that's going to be outsourced to AI. I mean, this is like one pathway of the future, not the pathway, but there's also, well, to be a plumber, you're going to have to be physically
Yeah.
able. Yeah, it's such a, I think, beautifully complex kind of area. So I'm not surprised that you've been researching it for 2 decades
Yeah.
and that you've done so much amazing work in it. And for those interested in the book that you have coming out, what was it called again?
So it's called Toxic Demography. We gave it a little bit of a clickbait title. And it's really about how every time we try to talk about demographic trends in the public arena, it gets hijacked for political purposes. And while we have been writing it for about 6 years, it only became more and more relevant as the years went on. And as you said at the top of this, people really seem to be paying more attention to these issues than they were a couple of years ago. So I hope that it will speak to this particular moment, even as it gives us a historical dive.
I do think that the politicization and
Yeah.
the ideological conflict aspect of it makes it a maybe tense topic sometimes to investigate, but definitely a really important one from a business perspective, because obviously you do work in that space quite extensively as well. Is there anything that you think a business leader should be really investigating? So, not just paying attention to with all of these evolving trends, but really digging into and thinking about what are you doing about this?
Several things, and but one easy one, and it's the one where I'm talking to businesses most lately, is in human resources. And so I really am noticing a lot of the big employers, seems to be clicking for them that the pipeline has changed. So that is your easy entry point to demographics. Happy to come to talk to people about that. We should hopefully be doing some more work in this area, and hopefully also we'll be able to get some research sponsored in this area as well about how demographic shifts are affecting your human resources pipeline, because I do think that's one area where people are tracking the trends and they already understand, like, you don't have to sell them on demographics. They've always been paying attention to it, maybe in different ways at different times, but you're already in. And so then you just say you can actually learn some really interesting things, and we can't answer everything for you. But again, that's not the point. It's what do you get to ask a different question because you've looked through this lens, or maybe get sent down a different track once you've looked through this lens. And so I've been having some really cool conversations with people about it. And then you see out of that they'll say, wow, we actually still have mandatory retirement at age 60, but I see your graph there, and that feels like it might not be the best decision for us, even in the short run. Like, it might not be. That might not be the best decision.
Something I'd love to be in the room for is Jennifer doing a thought experiment, going down the rabbit holes on a particular topic. And you can absolutely do that through, like Jennifer, through the Population Reference Bureau. Obviously, check out the books. Maybe one last question that I'd love to get your take on. So we have obviously this focus on generations and like naming generations, these really simple things. And I think it's like 15 years is the generational periods that we identify. So obviously everyone's obsessed with Gen Z right now. Actually, brands are now becoming obsessed with Gen Alpha. So the next generation that's just been born this year is Gen Beta. And then what's after that? Any idea of what they're going to name it?
No, but but whatever it is, it will have to do with that moment, right? And the marketers get to name this,
Mhm.
not the social scientists.
No.
That's for sure.
Oh, come on, guys, hand it over to the social scientists.
I know, right?
You're incredibly eloquent and so intelligent on this topic. So I'm so looking forward to your answer on this last question that I have for you, which is what your go-to is to look outside when you're wanting to get a completely fresh perspective.
Okay. So I have two, but I do use them as a discipline. One is the one, actually, both of these are probably fairly common answers, but I, so I'm only on Twitter to track people who think completely opposite of me. So my whole Twitter feed, as people who work with me know, and I'm not revealing anything. We're a nonpartisan institution. We are, we don't even do advocacy. We're here for just the facts, ma'am. But I intentionally follow people with whom I wildly disagree, and it can be tough. So I don't keep it on my phone. I only keep it on a browser. I go in, I check everything. But it's so good for me because I want to be speaking, and I want PRV to be speaking to the widest swath of people possible. And if we really care about data and evidence based, you know, policies and decisions, then we need to understand how other people see data and evidence. So I do that all the time. Make sure I check that. And then the other is I read really widely, and I'm never embarrassed if like I'm reading a romance novel. Who cares? That's fantastic. I remember reading something about children's literature, a nonfiction book, just for fun when I was writing 8 billion and counting. But then it had a whole chapter on how childhood mortality used to be so high and how it affected children's literature. And I was like, what a great story for the book. So I think just read whatever random thing that you're reading. Actually, there's a new book by Brady Hendricks. It's called Witchcraft for Wayward Girls. And I was reading it because it's part of my spooky October reading. And it's totally about young girls who would get pregnant, mid-century and get sent to these birthing homes and, kind of in this social system. And I was like, oh, that's totally relevant to work. So yeah, those two pieces.
It's really interesting too, because I can imagine that your brain, when you're reading these disparate topics, it like connects it back to everything. So it's probably quite an effort for you to be like, no, no, stop thinking about work and the relationship with demographics.
Yes,
Just enjoy the romance novel.
it is. It is very difficult. But so that's sometimes I have just recently finished some Cats That Solve Mysteries books, and those I can turn off my
Oh,
work
okay.
brain. Yeah.
A nice way to switch off and definitely healthier than doom scrolling on your
Yeah.
phone. So yeah, Jennifer, it's always a pleasure to speak with you.
You
This
too.
conversation was so insightful. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you. It's very fun to get to talk about this topic with you, all your expertise, and I look forward to a next conversation about this.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate, review, or share the show, and I will see you next time. Until then, keep looking outside.